Joining us now out of Bristol is Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Hello, Tony. It's been a while we've spoken, Tony, but it's a pleasure to have you back on the program. Tony, your thoughts on a so-called war on terror by the U.S. and how successful or unsuccessful it's been over the last 2.5 decades?
Well, look at the countries that we're talking about here: Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and some of the peripheral countries too, mostly Muslim countries. I think really we should be calling it the war on Islam, actually, and war on Muslims more particularly, the sorts of people who have that faith. This is really reminiscent, actually, of what was going on in the 1930s in Nazi Germany, where there was an attempt to wipe out the Jewish people of the Jewish faith. And there were all sorts of people that collaborated in that, both now and then. But who are the main perpetrators of this? Well, many will point to Bush and Blair, and many will look around the world as, I mean, millions of people are doing this. They're asking, where are Bush and Blair now? Why are they walking the streets after this horrific crime? And what is the point of having something called the International Criminal Court in The Hague if Bush and Blair are not being arrested and tried? Let's give them a chance to defend themselves, because this 500,000 people are now not able, are dead, and they're now not able to instigate that. I think the duty of us now today is to make sure that these two men, at the very least, are brought to trial. The problem is, as the criminal lawyer, the Canadian criminal lawyer, actually was born in the UK, Christopher Black has pointed out, the United States is one of the key countries involved in appointing the senior judges at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and yet they're not even signed up to the treaty, so they couldn't be tried. Bush couldn't be tried at the International Criminal Court. So basically you're talking about a criminal kangaroo court, and I think that the world, the United Nations and the rest of us have really got to get together and make sure that the international judicial system delivers some kind of justice for those 500,000 people. What they did with after the September the 11th attacks and declaring the war on terrorism was really an attempt to define the 21st century. With this, I mean, it is impossible to get rid of terrorism with terrorism. And that's what they've been doing. And also, they have been sponsoring terrorism. The Western nations, the NATO countries, have been sponsoring terrorism around the world. It's been proved quite clearly that there's been a lot of Saudi and US money being channeled through to ISIS to enable the creation of Al-Qaeda too, which was really started by the CIA back in Afghanistan in the 1980s under Operation Cyclone. So this radical, they call it, Islamic terrorism, is actually something that was sponsored by the West and the NATO countries in the first place, and they've actually carved up the world. There's the US Army General Thomas Barnett in 2005. He did a world map called Blueprints for Action, showing the non-integrated gap countries, and I suggest your listeners have a look at that, because it shows you the countries that the NATO and the United States and Britain are trying to destabilize because they're not integrating into their world order. There's a smaller map of the Middle East, which Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Peters in the US Army did as well, the New Middle East he called it, in 2006. So they are trying to define the 21st century world in their terms, and they're trying to carve up the world, much as the British Empire did in the early 20th century. And I don't think they're going to succeed, because slowly but surely their plans are running behind. But at the end of the day, we must, as I say, with Bush and Blair and similar people, there must be an international justice system, because it's simply not good enough for 500,000 people now to be dead with no justice for them.
And Tony, even if you fail to get recourse or justice for this 500,000 people, if you fail to go after someone like a Bush or a Blair, why not at least pursue some kind of international jurisprudence that prevents this kind of failed policy out of Washington and possibly out of the UK from repeating itself and turning this figure into 1 million or 2 million dead? We're getting nowhere. It's been unsuccessful. These figures are all civilians. They're not terrorists. And if they are, it's a fraction of this statistics that we're presenting here today.
Totally agree with you. And also, a very important point is that these policies, these military adventures, stealing for the tribe, which is what many British soldiers would admit quietly down the pub is what they're doing. Without justice, this will just be a recruiting sergeant for all sorts of terrorist groups. Obviously, terrorism costs money. A lot of that money, Scott Bennett, who appears on your programme quite regularly, he's pointed out much of it was channeled through Switzerland. But it's a recruiting sergeant. When you have these kind of destabilised countries, you're getting more terrorism. So the war on terrorism has created more terrorism. That's how absurd this is. And if you want to look at the real origins of this, I would suggest people go back to 1986 and look at a book by Benjamin Netanyahu. Remember him? He wrote a book called Terrorism: How the West Can Win. And he convinced many people in the 1990s and the early 2000s that the war on terrorism was a good idea and worth fighting. I think many people, particularly the families of the military in this part of the world and those who are relatives of the million that have been killed as a result of this war on terror, would disagree with Netanyahu over whether that was a wise policy.
Thank you there. Out of Bristol, Mr. Tony Ghazni, investigative journalist. Thank you, Tony, for your perspective there.
Thank you.
You bet.